I think I gave Raphael as a birthday present part of my time. Is that what happened here? Or,
I started 10 minutes late.
oh, I see. Very good, very good. So I'll try to be as quick as possible, and then we go for the coffee break. So it's a talk about modern monetary theory, and I worked very hard on the title. That's the best part of the paper. It's a minimal mathematical model for modern monetary theory. Now, just so I have a sense, how many of you have heard of MMT by a show of hand? Not that many, so that's great. So I can introduce you to it. So MMT has been in the news recently, so the best place to find news, of course, is Bloomberg. So economists worry that modern monetary theory is winning the argument in Washington. Of course, economists that don't agree with MMT are worried that it's winning the argument. And in particular, that with low interest rates, people are, where is it? Low interest rates to finance more spending. That's one of the tenets of MMT, that you should try to do more government spending when necessary, and we'll see what those conditions are. So that's I call MMT in the news. Why does that matter? Well, for example, Stephanie Kelton, who is a top proponent of MMT, she is the chief economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. So if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, fingers crossed, then this might even become reality one day. And Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, for example, hangs out with exactly that kind of crowd, and that's where she gets her economic advice and her economic background. Now, you might think that I'm jumping on the bandwagon here and trying to get popular with a popular topic, but I was doing MMT before it was cool, before people thought it was cool. So Stephanie came to the Fields Institute in 2013, was the year after I became deputy director there. I invited a bunch of people that I thought had interesting things to say, and Stephanie was one of them. Of course, she would never accept the invitation now, she's too important, but she was there. You can find it on YouTube. There's a video of me introducing Stephanie at the Fields Institute. MMT is so popular that it got to Brazil. Randy Wray is Stephanie's supervisor, so he's like the grandfather of the entire subject. By the way, he was Hyman Minsky's student, so there's a connection between MMT and Minsky, Raphael. He was recently in Brazil. This was from a few days ago, and he was debating or having a conversation. This is Lara Rezende, a Brazilian economist who used to be very orthodox and now has embraced more heterodox policies, including modern monetary theory. So that's just to flash that it's something that you might want to start paying attention to. What is it then? So now that I got your attention, let's talk what it is. So there is a lot. The first thing that happens when you start debating MMT is that somebody who is actually a practitioner of the theory, I'm not, I said I was doing it before it was cool, I was interested in it before it was cool. But the first thing that happens is that they're going to say, no, you're misrepresenting us, you're misquoting us. You write something and they say, no, that's not what we said. So I decided to put full quotes from Randy Wray and Eric Tymoigne in a paper about addressing criticisms of the theory. So they start the paper by saying, what is it about? So it has two fundamental sets of insights. One are institutional insights. So they spend a lot of time analyzing how the Treasury actually relates to the central bank and how bond auctions government bond auctions operate, which accounts are used, how monetary policy works. So not from a, let's assume that this is what's happening, but actually analyzing the details of those transactions and seeing if there's anything that can be abstracted from there about how the government funds itself. The second, and going in parallel with that, are theoretical insights, and a lot of it has to do with, so you see that the usefulness of combining the Treasury and the central bank, even if by statute, they are separated, but theoretically they should be treated as a combined entity. The causalities between, so what's driving economic variables macroeconomically, so trying to understand relationships of macroeconomic variables, but in particular, financial balances. And that's something that we're going to stress a lot in this talk. And then the functional role of taxes and bonds has to do with exactly how the government raises money, either by charging taxes or by selling bonds. And they say there's a more interesting connection there than what you might think. And what are the relevant constraints on the government? And based on those insights, of course, that's not where the theory ends. So why would Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez be interested in something like that? Well, because they can derive policy implications from it. And so that's the summary in their own words of what the theory says. The monetarily sovereign governments, that is to say, governments that can issue their own currency. So that doesn't include Italy, for example. Italy doesn't issue euros, so that's not a monetarily sovereign government, are always solvent and can afford to buy anything for sale in their domestic unit of account, even though they may face inflationary, so that's an economic constraint, or political constraints. They might not want to be buying everything that is for sale, but they can from a financial point of view. Huh?
Just one limitation. The only asset that they can't buy is inflation protected.
Okay, so that's what that's not a good. That's a financial contract. So they're talking about goods and services that are for sale in the unit of account. And then what are the policy insights is that they can use that kind of freedom to intervene in the economy to achieve policy goals. And you should put, for example, something like full employment. If you really believe that you shouldn't leave resources idle in the economy, that you shouldn't have 10, 20% unemployment in the economy, then you should act on it. And there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. They can be tackled separately. They can be tackled as two separate goals that need to be addressed independently. So you need to want both price stability and full employment, and in addition to those two that are the usual trade-offs the central bank says that they're constrained to, you want financial stability. All right, and then the key policy proposal arising from that is what's called the Job Guarantee Program, or going back to Minsky, was using the government as an employer of last resort, and we're going to see how that works. So the key idea is that if there are unemployed people who are willing to work, if there are unemployed people who don't want to work, you cannot force, you cannot put a gun in their head and say, go and work. But if they're willing to work, they're looking for jobs, and they cannot get jobs, then the government ought to provide jobs for them. Then we can get into what they're going to be doing. That's not as relevant, because there's always a big list of things that the government should be doing, and allegedly it's not doing because it doesn't have the resources. There's these people say that, no, you first establish your list of priorities, and then you go through it. There's always stuff to be done. In particular, in light of what we've been talking during the weekend of climate change. There's a ton of things that need to be done for climate change that the private sector is not interested in doing. So the extremely clever way that they're capturing the imagination of the American people now is combining these two things. On the one hand, you offer the job guarantee as a macroeconomic stabilization policy, and then whenever somebody says, but doing what? You say, here's what. Climate change. And then there's a huge list of things to be done. And they call that the Green New Deal, and it's the hottest thing in Washington, either if you like it or if you dislike, because even the people who dislike, they can see the appeal. They can see, the people catching on fire when Bernie Sanders mentions it, or others, and they see how dangerous it might be if you don't like that kind of a politician. All right, so criticisms. Well, the criticisms, there's a lot of ink spilled on the origins of money, because they talk what comes first, private debt, public debt, what is money used for. I find the whole thing a bit tiring. I never ask myself what came first. As you're going to see in the models, it's a circuit. Doesn't matter where in the circuit you start. You just pinpoint where you want to be, and then you just analyze the flows. So you never see me discussing the origins of anything. I take it as so there. Let us assume as an axiom that there exists an economy. So the economy is there and it's operating, and then we analyze it. I don't want to know where it came from. Huh? Unbelievable, right? But there are other criticisms. So, for example, what about inflation? Well, the quote that I just mentioned does acknowledge the risk of inflation, but is it acknowledged in a sufficiently strong way? So is there a bigger threat of inflation that MMT is not acknowledging? What about currency devaluation? They start buying a bunch of things, the currency could go down, international investors might not be interested in putting money in the country, all sorts of things can go wrong. And related to that, there can be financial instability, and also related to currency devaluation, what happens if you're not the United States? A lot of the theory was developed in the United States, and many people say it's very US-centric. It can only work because the dollar, that is the thing that the US government has the monopoly to issue, is the reserve currency of the world. And what if you are in Brazil? Can you do that? What if you're in Argentina? Can you do that? So that's a criticism. And can the job guarantee or other policies actually be implemented without being disruptive in the actual labor market? But the one that I want to concentrate here is the lack of a mathematical model. So for a long time, people would say, because these proponents are very clever and historically minded and institutionally minded, but whenever you ask them to write down a model, the model invariably comes out as a sort of oversimplified one equation or two equations model, and analyzing only one part of the theory, and then you say, well, but what about that? And so, well, that's not in the model. You need to have a model analyze that, and then they change the model. So it's a combination of 10 or 20 different one or two equation models. They each treat different aspects of it. But this is macroeconomics. You don't do that, right? Microeconomics you can do like that, but not macro. Macro, you have to analyze all those effects. So that's the challenge that Alex Lipton, who started this off, he was in my first slide, I didn't mention explicitly, but he's the co-author in this paper. He started off with a Skype call with him, tearing his hair and say, I just read on Bloomberg that people are considering this nonsense of modern monetary theory. What do you think of that? And I said, well, it's nice that you ask, because, I've been reading about that for many, many years. Let's talk about it. And then through long conversations, one by one, his objections to the theory were dropping, and now we're writing this paper not as trying to defend the theory, but as a mathematical model where you can test the implications and you can test the validity of the theory, okay? So hence the mathematical model in there. And then the minimal, of course, is kind of a joke, because as soon as you start actually looking at all the pieces that need to be modeled, and I'm going to do that in the most economical way possible, economical in the sense of simplified. I'm never going to put any assumption that we could get away without. All the assumptions I'm going to put is because, and you can challenge that, and I'll tell you why that assumption is there. But then the model started to grow and grow and grow and grow, and you see in the end what it's going to look like. Okay, so that's the accounting structure, the stock flow consistent table for the model. If you're not familiar with the stock flow consistent models, it's because you never came to one of my talks. And, but in case you didn't, what they do is divide the economy in sectors and look at the interconnected balance sheets of those sectors and the transfers of funds from one sector to another, for example, through consumption, that will alter the composition of the balance sheets. And by following those, that's why it's a stock and flow, by following the interconnected relationships and of this flow of funds, you can create a dynamic model for the economy. So this is just, you're not supposed to go line by line, but the purpose of things like that is, for example, wages are paid here by this sector and received by that sector, and so on and so forth. So now in the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I'm going to go one by one through the sectors and see what are the important things that they are doing in the model. So, but if in case you came to any of my talks before, you would know that the sector that I tend to concentrate the most is the firm sector, because that's where investment tends to be the dominant component, and that's where Minsky spent most of his time analyzing, and the people who try to model things after Minsky, for example, Steve King. But then we quickly realized that we cannot do an MMT model, only concentration on firms, because after all, the whole point of a job guarantee is that then you have households that have a supplementary income if they are unemployed, and that supplementary income has to have an effect in the model more than just the investment that is done by firms. So I had to have a household, a fully fledged household sector, which was something that I had only done in one of my papers before and walked away from it because it looked too ugly, but here I had to incorporate. So I'm going to start with the households. So what do households do? Well, what is the wealth of the households? It's composed of three assets. They can have cash, which is denoted by H, not by C, because C is going to be consumption. So H stands for high power money, which should give you a hint that there are other types of money. There are lower power money in the model. So, for example, deposits. So high power money. Theta is for Treasury bills, because they needed some letter that was similar to T, so that's theta. So Treasury bills held by households. And M are deposits, and not D, because D is going to be something else also. But M is for the money supply. So that's going to be the full money supply in the model, the addition of cash and deposits. And the index is H for households. So these are Treasury bills that are held by households. That's the deposits of households. Okay, now pi denotes profits, so it's anything that is income. So what is the income of the households? Where do they get their money? They receive wages. They receive interest from the government on the bills that they hold. They receive interest on deposits from the deposits that they have in the bank. They receive dividends from the firms. This is a good sector, it's just receiving stuff. They receive dividends from the firms that are owned by part of the households, and they receive dividends from the banks that are owned by part of the households. Now, they pay taxes out of that, so we're assuming proportional taxes, so there's a tax rate for the income, so their after-tax income is this, and then what do they do with this after-tax income? They spend on consumption. And whatever the difference between the two is their savings. So where they're going to put their savings, they're going to put their savings into their wealth. So the savings is what's going to change their wealth. If savings is positive, the wealth is going up. But the wealth now has three components, so how do they choose to hold money, deposits, or government bonds? Well, they have portfolio preferences, and the portfolio preferences tell them their intended proportions in the portfolios, and they can depend on the relative returns of these different assets. So this is what James Tobin proposed and got a Nobel Prize for in the 1980s. Very well. What do firms do? Well, firms are the engine of the economy. Their net worth, which is the wealth of the firms, is composed of the capital that they have, and this is not financial capital, this is physical capital, machineries, desks, buildings, and so on. They also, and this is a novelty in the model, they hold inventories, because we're going to have a model that has mismatch between supply and demand. That's important. I cannot get away with a model as I had done before in other papers where I assumed that everything was sold. I need to have some accumulation of inventories. So we track the inventories of the firms. The capital is priced at the price of goods. The inventory is not priced at the price of goods because you haven't sold the inventory yet. You price your inventory at the production cost. So that's the cost there. They have deposits in the banks, but then they have negative assets, which is a liability. They owe money to the bank in the form of loans. What are the profits of firms? So they sell stuff. So Y is the national GDP, is the gross domestic product, but that's, and actually this is wrong, should be a P type, no, it's because it's YN is nominal. nominal GDP, so that's correct. And we're going to see later on what it is, but you already know what it is. It's the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and then the trade-off balance, so exports minus imports. Okay, so they sell all that, they make a bunch of money selling it, but they have to do something with the money. In addition to the money that they make selling stuff, they receive interest. That's very small, but they do receive interest on deposits. Now, this is a large amount of, a large chunk of money is wages. Typically, in an entire country, you have like 65 to 68% of the whole GDP is paid on wages, so that's a large number. And then they pay interest on debt, and that can be large or small depending on the size of the debt, and this is something that we're going to be monitoring, the size of the private debt as a proportion of GDP. Okay, that's their undistributed profits, so to speak, or profits before tax. Then they pay tax on that. And then, so this would be 1 minus tau, the tax rate for firms. And then they have some dividends that are paid, and dividends have to be paid as a proportion of after-tax profits. You don't pay dividends on before-tax profits. So that's this fraction here, is the fraction that you distribute to shareholders. So that's the retained profits. That's what is left over for the firms to do something with it. What they normally want to do with that, so that's the savings of the firms. There's an accountant for depreciation here, and that's there to satisfy the accountants because you pay first from depreciation and then you put that in a separate account so that you can add that to your savings later. Believe me, that's how it goes. Now, morally, what do you do with your savings? You invest. So here is the investment, and again, that's why the depreciation was there, because it's net investment, investment net of depreciation. If you want to ignore depreciation, go ahead, but I had to put it in the paper. But the moral here is that the difference between what they want to spend, which is their investment, and what they have, and also the change in inventory, because that's an unexpected change in their wealth, we're going to see later. But this difference between what they spend and what they have is the amount that they have to borrow. And the amount that they have to borrow is the difference between loans and deposits. And now you can split the things between loans and deposits in many different ways. So you had to make a choice here, just like households make a choice. What I'm assuming is that all of the new stuff, new investment that needs to be done is done by increase in loans. And then all the profits that you receive from your sales go into the deposit. So that's the current account of the firms. And then there is a repayment, a proportional repayment that goes from one account to another and decreases both of them. But anyway, so that's what firms are doing. So we've done 2 out of 5, but the last 2 are very trivial, so bear with me. So we've done households, we've done firms. Banks, what do? Well, they provide loans to firms and they accept deposits of households. So what is the balance sheet of the bank? So that's the sum of their assets. So they have deposits. They also hold government bonds because that's how they're going to be transacting with the central bank, by buying and selling government bonds. They have to have reserves in the central bank, and they will transact exactly by purchasing or selling reserves. And they have deposits. So XB is the net worth of banks. What are the profits of the banks is the difference between what they make in interest and what they pay in interest. That's the profit of the banks. Now, what do they do with the profit, and how do they balance the balance sheet? They have 2 constraints to balance. One is a reserve requirement, so they need to hold by law a fraction of reserves, a fraction of deposits in the form of reserves. And that fraction can be 0 because there are countries that don't have reserve requirements, so the model works very well with a 0 reserve requirement. But most countries have minimal capital requirements, so they have the net worth, the capital that they have, needs to be a fraction of their assets, but the risk-weighted assets, so we're going to simplify, we're going to say that the risk weight in reserves and government bonds is 0, so it's just a fraction of the loans that they're selling. They need to have as capital. So now you combine this, and then you can see that the savings of the banks, which is just the profits after tax, minus the dividends that they pay to the owners of the banks, is going to be the change in the net worth of the bank. But if you want to maintain that net worth above a certain minimal capital requirement, that tells you how much dividends you can pay. So you can pay more dividends if you have extra capital that is above the capital requirements, and if you have your capital drops below capital requirements, you restrict the amount of dividends that you pay. So dividends is a dynamic variable in the theory as well. So households, firms, banks, what about the Treasury? So here's the core of the MMT proponent is the way that Treasury interacts with the central bank. Some of the theory is written as a amalgamation of the two into a government sector. I put the two separate because then you can follow the actual accounting, but if you want to then amalgamate, you just add the two sectors in that big matrix that we have. But okay, so G is for government, but it's really the Treasury. What are the assets of the government? Well, they have an account with the Fed. That's the first important institutional innovation here. I mean, it's not an innovation. That's what actually happens. But in normal economic models, like more traditional economic models, you ignore that. But that's very important here because it's the buffer that they use to actually do their spending. So there is an account that the Treasury has with the central bank. Okay? And of course, they have as a liability the government bills, the Treasury bills that they issue. Now, the Treasury bills are composed of household bills, bills that are held by the banks, as I just said, and bills that are held by the central bank. So the central bank is a purchaser of government debt. In the United States, about, it varies with time, but at least a third of gross government debt is purchased by the central bank. And in times when they actually need to provide more liquidity to the market, they buy a lot of government debt and in exchange of reserves, and that portion can go even higher. So there are lots of government bonds that are owned by the central bank. Now, what is the spending of government in this model? There are two sources of spending. So there's one that I'm going to call just like the regular spending. So that's the spending that Congress debates every year, what should be done. The military, expend this, expand Medicare, do that. So that's this regular spending outside of the job guarantee. So there's spending in the job guarantee, and then there's GS, which is the government spending as you normally understand it. The government spending as you normally understand, I'm going to say, is just a fraction of total capital, total nominal capital in the country. And that fraction varies from country to country, goes between 15 to 20 to 25% in European countries, a bit smaller in the United States. But that's a fraction that you can estimate. Of course, it fluctuates in time, but it's not too fluctuating, so we're going to just assume that it's a constant. Now, the other one, it's the innovation, it's the job guarantee. So that's something that the government spends in reaction to the level of unemployment. So there's going to be the people who are employed in the job guarantee, which we're going to see how to determine in a second, and the wages that are paid in the job guarantee. And now, one of them is totally elastic. It just accommodates it's a mirror of what's happening in the private sector. So the people employed in the job guarantee go up if there's more unemployment in the private sector. And the other one is fixed by the government. The wage that is paid, they can pay whatever they want. So that can be either a constant wage or it can be a wage increasing at a rate of inflation that is determined by the government. So that's what the government spends. Now, where does the government acquire revenue? This is essential for MMT. It's of course, through taxes. And then we said that taxes are just fractions of the different profits of the other three sectors, households, firms, and banks. Therefore, the budget equation for the government, which you normally would have as just the deficit spending, which is spending minus tax, plus what you're paying in interest on debt, would just be the change in debt. It's the change in debt minus the change in the account with the central bank. Because one way to do deficit spending is just increase or decrease the account that you have with the central bank. So you have some money in the central bank, so the government has some amount in the central bank, and it just dictates to the central bank, pay Alberto. And then Alberto works for me, for the government, in return of receiving central bank money. Actually, it doesn't receive central bank money directly. The central bank will deposit in Alberto's bank by crediting them with reserves, and Alberto's bank would deposit in Alberto's deposit account. So one direct way for the government to fund its spending, if you like, is to reduce its account in the central bank. The other is to issue bonds. And the balance between the two is something that that MMT is deeply interested in, and we're going to be modeling explicitly. When do I have to stop, really?
10 minutes ago. You
It's not 10 minutes ago. Don't give me. Yeah. Talk to the central bank, exactly. Okay, I'm gonna borrow from Rene. Where's Rene? There's Rene. So, huh? Yeah, okay. 5 minutes, okay. I'm not gonna take too much more. No, I will take a little bit more than 5, but not too much more. So we've done what the Treasury does. Then what about the central bank? Well, the central bank is, I told you the last two sectors are very easy. So the central bank is just transaction with both the government and the banks as a sort of a buffer variable. They accommodate what the banks and the governments are doing, the demand for reserves and then demand for advances. So the wealth of the central bank is just the government bonds that they hold minus the cash, minus the advances of the bank, of the government, minus the reserves. If I could come up with another letter D, then that would be hard, but I only have hard. What? No, that's not an asset. Interest, oh, yeah. Okay. And then for the foreign sector is denoted with a star. I'm assuming, again, it's a minimal model. In reality, the foreign sector can have all sorts of assets in the domestic economy. They can have bank accounts, they can have shares, they can have real estate, they can have ownership of firms, they have all sorts of things. In this model, it's, again, the minimal thing that I can have. They have cash. They have the same type of cash that the domestic citizens have. And we're going to see that then the cash that is held by foreigners increase if the imports are higher than the exports. So if the country wants to import more than it exports, it needs to pay foreigners with its own cash for that. And the cash held by foreigners goes up by the same amount. So this is the trade of balance of trade, and this is the capital account. And in the model, the capital account equals the balance of trade, so things match. Very well. So did all the sectors. Now I need a little bit of behavior assumptions. The first and most important, and the other ones will go much quicker, is the job guarantee program, how it works. So we're going to say that a fraction of the unemployed people are going to be employed in the job guarantee. And if you adjust that fraction to 0, it just means you're not doing a program at all. If you adjust J to 100 to 1, then that means you want full employment. So now this is a policy decision, and it's a parameter of the model. And whereas in the private sector, what is produced determines how many people are employed through the productivity, and in turn determines what the employment rate is. In the job guarantee, you always know how much people are going to be employed because it's just the employment in the total population minus the employed in the private sector, and that determines how much is produced in the job guarantee program. It's not the other way around. You first determine how many people are employed, and then they produce some stuff. Very well. There's a wage price dynamics here that says that in the private sector, wages go up if the labor market is tight. Wages go up if there is a lot of inflation, so they try to incorporate inflation. I think somebody's going to talk about money illusion tomorrow or Wednesday. That's exactly this effect. And then wages go up if there is expected inflation from the part of workers. Now, how does inflation change? Well, inflation goes up if there is a lot of demand for goods, and that's captured through utilization of resources. Inflation goes up if wages go up, so that's why a wage price spiral. And inflation will also go up if expected inflation goes up. Now, how does expected inflation go up? That's a tracking variable of actual inflation. So if you observe inflation being too high for a long time, you begin to expect that inflation is going to remain high. And Brazilians have a lot of experience about that. In the job guarantee program, the inflation of wages in the job guarantee, as I said, is a variable that is controlled by the government. So the total wage bill is just the sum of the wages in the private sector plus the wages paid in the job guarantee. Now, I can completely skip that because I gave a talk about that a few years ago. It's just how the firm sector behaves and adjusts their expected sales and inventories, except that now it has an extra source of consumption that is coming from workers in the job guarantee, but we can skip it. Consumption now is something that I cannot skip that quickly because it's important here. It's going to be an increase in function of income. So if there is more income in the households, there's going to be more consumption, and the income is supported by the job guarantee. So there's a floor in the consumption of households here. There's also a part of the consumption that's going to be done with imports, and that's an increasing function of real exchange rate, because the real exchange rate measures how cheap it is to buy imported goods. It's how many imported goods per domestic good you can get. So if the real exchange rate goes up, you're better off buying imported goods, so you're going to increase your imports like this. That's the real exchange rate, and the nominal exchange rate just measures how many units of domestic currency versus foreign currency. Very well. Then investment and exports. Again, you can skip investment. I spoke about that many times, but investment is a function of profits. Rafael was talking about profitability, but now he's leaping. But that's exactly what is going on there. High profits mean high investment, and then a lot of borrowing to fund that investment. Exports is the rest of the world. We are not going to be saying that this government is so powerful that they can influence the rest of the world. Exports is just going to be a fraction of GDP of the rest of the world. But that fraction depends on inversely proportional to the real exchange rate. So now if imports go up because the real exchange rate is favorable, that means that exports are going to go down. But they don't need to go up and down one-to-one. There are different propensities of import and export. Okay, now just two more behavioral things. Monetary policy. So this government, through the central bank, adjusts the policy rate as following a target rate, and the target rate itself follows the growth in the economy. So this is not a Taylor rule where you just focus on inflation and output gap. This is a bit more fundamental than a Taylor rule, but it's in the same vein, that if the economy is tanking, then the interest rate goes down to stimulate the economy. And yes, Ernst, the interest rate can go negative because there's no restriction here in this dynamic saying that it needs to remain positive. And then it also includes as a special case 0 if you put this constants equal to 0, and that's a policy proposal of MMT that we can also analyze. And we're going to be assuming that deposit rates are equal to the policy rates because they're very close, in practice indistinguishable for the macroeconomic aspects that I want, and that the lending rate, which is what the banks charge for loans, is just a spread on top of the policy rate. And here's a graph showing that. So the blue line is the policy rate. When you track deposits rates, it's almost on top of it, and the lending rate is just a little spread on top of that. Now, the spread itself can go up and down. Of course, you're all interest rate modeler experts, but I'm not going to be dealing with that here. I'm just going to assume it's a constant spread. Okay, the balance of payments, I spoke about that, is exports minus imports. That tells you now all the components that you need to know for domestic output, and we're assuming an exchange rate dynamics that is natural, is the inflation differential and the balance of trade. Okay. With that all there, and now I'm coming to the end, you put it all together and you have this simple dynamical system of 15 equations. Now, what's neat about this is that, you know, it combines 3 or 4 papers that I had written before where parts of those equations were there. So not exactly, disjoint sets of equations, but focusing on parts of the equations. But of course, there's some new equations. And there are some new equations that don't matter that much, but they're just there because they're necessary. For example, like the word GDP, it has a growth rate, but I need to put it there because it enters as a variable for exports, and exports are a variable for consumption, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not at all the case that all those equations are equally as important. You can see there's a lot more letters in those equations down here because they are the equations of the financial sector in the domestic economy. And the equations there are grouped by their mutual dependencies, and Tom just suggested to do a network of these equations to see which variables are pointing to what, so that we can see, you know, the core of the equations and then which of the equations are less relevant. If you think that there are many equations, there are even more this is the interior equilibrium. You can deduce what it is, and that's what we're going to be chasing. We're going to be trying to see that there is a feasible solution to this model that conforms with the MMT prescriptions. But if you thought that there were too many equations, wait until you see how many parameters. So that they are the parameters. And the parameters are a combination of arcs and sines. So there are some parameters that you can evaluate very easily from econometrics, but there are some that not so much. You need to think about what they should be and put some good range of those parameters. Now, that's very easy if you have a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional equation, but if you're doing in a 15-dimensional equation, it's kind of tricky. Nevertheless, we programmed that. We got for the 5-dimensional core of the firm sector something that resembles some of the models that I had done before for the Keene model. For the monetary policy and government spending, here is the interest rate stabilizing at a value. That's the government spending stabilizing at 4 times GDP. That's high. That's high government spending. But okay, Japan has 2 now. Who says that you cannot have 4? Now you can do this with even worse initial conditions. Now you can see this effect of interest rates going negative for a while before stabilizing, and you see the government ratio, the debt ratio of the government climbing up, but also stabilizing at some point. So what we provide is a mathematical model that can test the hypothesis of MMT. We haven't tested everything. The first thing that we tested is that it exists and that I can have a combination of parameters that are not too far from realistic parameters. All those parameters there that could be estimated were estimated. There are some that I had to find in other papers, but nevertheless, they are not crazy parameters. It is possible to construct this model. The model is high-dimensional, has many structural and policy parameters. You can only do sensitivity analysis here by means of heavy-duty statistics, and that's what another professor at McMaster is helping me with, a lot of experience doing biostatistics models, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So